Say one word to your dog right now, its name, walk, anything it knows, and watch what happens. The head cocks to one side, ears lift, eyes lock onto your face. It's one of the most photographed, most gifted, most adored moments in the entire animal kingdom, and almost everyone has a theory for it. Some people will tell you it's about hearing you better. Some will tell you it's about seeing your face better, because their muzzle blocks the view. Some will just tell you it's cute and leave it there. Here's the problem. 2 of those 3 explanations have been repeated online for over a decade, and almost nobody stops to check where they actually came from or whether anyone ever tested them. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you what the science really says about each one, including a study published less than a year ago that used AI to track this behavior frame by frame and found something none of the popular explanations predicted. This is petmindlabs. Let's stop guessing and start seeing. Let's lay the 3 explanations on the table honestly, because the way most videos handle this is actually kind of a mess. They'll tell you all 3 reasons in one breath, as if they carry equal weight. They don't, and figuring out which one holds up is the whole point of this video. The first theory says dogs tilt their heads to hear you more clearly, that turning the ear helps pin down exactly where a sound is coming from. That one sounds reasonable. Dogs really do have remarkable hearing, and their ears really do move independently to track sound. We'll test it properly in a minute. The second theory says it's about seeing your face. The idea is that a dog's muzzle sits right in the middle of its own field of view, blocking the lower part of a human face, the mouth, the chin, the part that carries a lot of emotional information. Tilt the head, and suddenly that blind spot clears. This theory has a name attached to it, a real psychologist, and an actual data set. We'll go there too, and I'll show you exactly what that data set is, and just as importantly, what it isn't. The third theory barely counts as a theory. It's the shrug. Dogs know it makes them look adorable, so they do it for the reaction. It's the explanation with the least evidence and the most repetition. Here's what almost nobody tells you. A dog's head tilt doesn't happen randomly. It shows up overwhelmingly in one specific situation when a person is talking to it, not during silence, not while staring at a wall, when language is directed at it. That single fact should make you suspicious of any explanation that doesn't have anything to do with what's happening inside the dog's skull when it hears you talk. So the real question isn't, does hearing matter or does vision matter? Dogs obviously use both senses constantly. The real question is, which of these 3 stories actually explains the tilt itself, the specific, sideways, mid-sentence cock of the head, and which ones are just plausible-sounding guesses that got repeated so many times they started to feel true? To answer that, we need to look at 3 completely different kinds of science. The physics of how a dog's ears actually work. One very small and very human data set from over a decade ago, and a brain study so new it was published less than a year before this video. Let's start with hearing, because this is the theory built on the most solid ground, and also the one most people get slightly wrong. It's true that a dog's hearing outperforms yours in almost every way that matters for locating a sound. Research on canine hearing thresholds going back to a classic 1,983 study measuring dogs of different sizes found that dogs can detect sound frequencies from around 67 Hz up to roughly 45,000 Hz. An adult human tops out at about 20,000 Hz on a good day, and that's before your ears have taken 20 years of concerts and traffic noise. Your dog isn't hearing a slightly louder version of your world. It's hearing a wider one, genuinely picking up frequencies you are physically incapable of detecting, no matter how quiet the room is. And the reason dogs can do this comes down to hardware, not magic. Each ear is controlled by more than a dozen separate muscles, letting the pinna, the visible flap, rotate, tilt, and swivel almost independently of the other ear, like 2 small satellite dishes tracking different signals at once. That's the mechanical foundation of everything that follows. So here's the part where we actually test the theory instead of just repeating it. If tilting the head helps a dog figure out exactly where a sound is coming from, we should be able to measure that. And in 2022, a team at the University of Padova's Laboratory of Applied Ethology did exactly that kind of measurement, not on head tilting directly, but on the underlying skill the theory depends on, how precisely a dog can tell 2 sound sources apart. They used something called a minimum audible angle test. Picture 2 speakers in an arc in front of the dog, playing the same sound from slightly different positions. The question is, how close together can those 2 speakers be before the dog can no longer tell which one made the noise? Using 10 dogs and a method that gradually narrowed the angle as each dog improved, the researchers found the average dog could distinguish sound sources separated by about 7.6 degrees. Some individual dogs got as precise as roughly 1 to 2 degrees with practice. The least precise needed about 13 degrees of separation. Now here's the twist. Almost nobody mentions when they bring up dogs have great hearing. For pinpointing exactly where a sound is coming from, not just detecting that a sound exists, but locating its precise source, dogs are actually less precise than you are. The same body of research puts the human minimum audible angle at around 1.3 degrees. Your dog can hear a dog whistle you'll never register in your life, but if you and your dog are both trying to figure out which of two nearly overlapping speakers just clicked, you'll probably win. Why the gap? The researchers point to something elegant. Across many mammal species, sound localization precision tracks almost perfectly with how narrow an animal's zone of sharpest vision is. Animals that evolved to focus on a tiny, precise point directly ahead like humans also evolved incredibly precise hearing to match, because the whole system is built to swing your eyes exactly onto whatever made the noise. Dogs with a wider, less pinpoint-focused visual field didn't need or get quite that same acoustic precision. So where does that leave the head tilt for hearing theory? Here's the honest answer, and it's more nuanced than a yes or a no. The researchers who ran this exact study raised the possibility based on similar work in cats that moving the ears, or the head, could help sharpen localization even further, the way turning your own head toward a sound helps you triangulate it. That's a reasonable hypothesis. But in this particular study, the dogs' heads were held still on a headrest for the whole test. Nobody has actually run the experiment that would prove a tilted head localizes sound better than a level 1 in a dog. The hardware is clearly built for precision hunting of sound. Whether the tilt specifically adds to that precision is still an open question, not a settled fact, and that's a very different thing from the confident, they tilt their heads to hear better, you'll read everywhere. Now the second theory vision, and this is where I need you to pay close attention, because this is exactly the kind of claim that sounds scientific but isn't quite what it seems. In 2013, a psychology professor named Stanley Coren, who studies sensory perception, proposed an idea. He noticed that a dog's muzzle sits directly in its own line of sight. Try making a fist and holding it against your nose sometime, then look at someone's face. You'll lose the bottom half of it, the mouth, the chin, a huge amount of the emotional information a face carries. Coren's idea was that dogs tilt their heads to shift that blind spot out of the way and see your mouth more clearly. It's a genuinely clever idea, but here's what actually happened next, and it matters. Coren didn't run a laboratory study. He ran an informal online survey. 582 dog owners answered questions about their dog's head shape and how often it tilted its head. Owners of longer-muzzled dogs, collies, retrievers reported head tilting, often 71% of the time. Owners of flatter-faced dogs, pugs, Boston Terriers reported it 52% of the time. Now, on its own, that's a real, honest difference. 71 versus 52 is not nothing. But look closely at what that data actually is. It isn't a measurement. Nobody filmed a single dog. It's people's memories of how often their dog does something, sorted into 6 vague categories from never to always. It was never submitted to a scientific journal or reviewed by other researchers. And Coren himself, to his credit, was upfront about this. He called it speculation, going in, and wrote afterward that this was only the early stages of research. I want to be really clear about why I'm spending this much time on it. It's not that the idea is silly, it's actually one of the more interesting theories out there. It's that this single blog post from over a decade ago has quietly become settled science on hundreds of pet websites. You'll find it repeated as fact, with the survey part left out entirely. That's the difference between a scientist having a smart hunch and a peer-reviewed finding, and almost nobody selling you this fact bothers to tell you which one you're getting. And there's a wrinkle in the data itself that even Coren pointed out. 52% of brachycephalic dogs, the flat-faced ones, with barely any muzzle blocking their view, still tilted their heads often. If the theory were the whole explanation, you'd expect flat-faced dogs to almost never need to tilt. They still do it more than half the time. So even by the survey's own numbers, muzzle obstruction is at best part of the picture, not the whole answer. So neither of the first two theories fully holds up on its own, which brings us to the newest piece of the puzzle, and this is the part that changes the whole picture. Just months before this video was made, in October 2025, a team of researchers published the most direct test of head tilting ever conducted. Instead of a survey, they used community-collected video and an AI landmark detection system technology built specifically to map a dog's face to measure head tilts frame by frame in 103 dogs. Here's their setup. Each dog was filmed in 4 separate situations. First, just resting, with no interaction. Second, the owner making quiet eye contact, no talking. Third, the owner reading a neutral, unfamiliar passage out loud about ancient Egyptian pyramids, a topic no dog has any reason to care about. And fourth, the owner speaking familiar words and phrases to the dog, in a warm, natural tone, the kind of thing you'd actually say to your dog. Now watch what happened to the tilting behavior across those four conditions. During rest, almost nothing. During silent eye contact, almost nothing. During the unfamiliar speech about pyramids, a small uptick, but nowhere close to significant. And then, during familiar speech words, the dog actually knew head tilting shot up dramatically above every other condition. The statistical difference was enormous. A chi-square test found this pattern was essentially impossible to be chance. At a confidence level, scientists consider about as solid as it gets. That result alone tells you something the hearing and vision theories can't explain. If it were purely about acoustics, picking up a sound and locating it, the unfamiliar pyramid passage should have triggered just as much tilting as the familiar one. Same volume, same voice, same direction. It didn't. And if it were purely about seeing your face better, the silent eye contact condition where the dog had every reason to want a clear look at your expression should have triggered tilting too. It barely did. The one thing that reliably triggered the behavior was hearing something the dog understood. But the researchers didn't stop at when. They also looked at which way. And this is where it gets genuinely strange, in the best way. When the dogs in this study did tilt their heads during familiar speech, they leaned to the right significantly more often than to the left. That detail connects to something discovered almost a decade earlier, using a completely different method. Back in 2016, a team led by Attila Andics put dogs into an MRI scanner fully awake, trained to lie still, and recorded their brain activity while they listened to their trainer's voice. The scans revealed something remarkable. The left hemisphere of a dog's brain handles the meaning of a word, regardless of tone, while a separate region on the right side handles how something is said, the emotional tone, the intonation. And the reward centers of the brain only lit up strongly when both sides agreed. The right words, said the right way. Here's why that matters for the head tilt. Your body is wired in reverse. The left side of the brain controls and receives signals more strongly from the right side of the body, and vice versa. So a rightward head tilt lines up with left hemisphere engagement, the same hemisphere that just lit up in the MRI scanner specifically for processing word meaning. The dogs in the 2025 study weren't just tilting more when they heard familiar words. They were tilting toward the side of their body, connected to the part of the brain that understands language. Put those two studies together, 8 years apart, using completely different methods. One, an MRI scanner, one, a phone camera, and AI tracking. And they land on the same conclusion from two different directions. That's not proof beyond all doubt. But in science, when two independent methods point at the same mechanism, that's about as close to solid ground as you get outside of a physics lab. Now, here's where petmindlabs does the thing the other channels skip. I want to argue with the study I just spent 5 minutes building up, because the real science is more careful than the highlight reel. The 2025 research team didn't just report their big finding, they reported its limits too. And one of those limits is worth knowing. In their own paper, they pointed to an earlier, separate study on canine facial expressions that found dogs also tilt their heads when something startles them, the classic example being a jack-in-the-box popping open. That's not language. That's not a familiar word. That's pure surprise. So the honest, careful version of the conclusion isn't head tilts always mean your dog understood a word. It's something more precise. In this study, the strongest, the most reliable trigger for tilting was hearing familiar, meaningful speech far more than unfamiliar speech or silence. But tilting itself isn't exclusively a language behavior. It may be one visible sign of a broader thing happening in the brain, something like heightened attention, or the brain briefly pausing to process something unexpected or important, whether that something is a word it knows or a toy box that just popped open. There's a second honest caveat, and it's just as important. In this same study, only about 4 in 10 dogs tilted their heads at all across every condition combined. If your dog has never once cocked its head at you, that says nothing bad about your bond or your dog's intelligence. It might mean your dog processes attention differently, shows it through a different channel entirely, ears, tail, a stillness instead of a tilt, or simply wasn't part of that lucky 40%. The tilt is a fascinating window into the canine brain. It is not a report card. And one more detail, because it's genuinely interesting and it undercuts a stereotype at the same time. Male dogs in that study tilted noticeably more often than female dogs. About 55% of neutered males did it, compared to about 25% of spayed females. Researchers connect this to something also seen in humans. Language processing tends to sit more heavily in one hemisphere for males and spread more evenly across both hemispheres for females. It's not that female dogs understand less. It's that their brains may be doing the same job with a more balanced, two-sided approach, one that doesn't necessarily show up as a visible tilt. So let's step back and reframe the whole question, because I think the real story here isn't which theory won. It's what this tells you about what's actually happening when your dog looks at you like that. For years, the head tilt got treated as a kind of decoration, a cute side effect of dog anatomy, filed in the same mental folder as puppy dog eyes or a wagging tail, something dogs just do. But look at what the 2025 evidence actually points to. A behavior that spikes specifically, precisely, when your dog hears a word, it has learned and leans toward the exact side of the body wired to the language processing half of its brain. That reframes the whole gesture. It's not your dog performing cuteness for a reward. It's not primarily your dog straining to hear a frequency it already hears effortlessly, or straining to see a mouth it's been scanning since it was a puppy. In the moment its head cocks sideways, there's a real chance you're watching a snapshot of active thought, your dog's brain doing something startlingly close to what your own brain does. When you hear a word and pause half a second to place it, and that connects to something bigger about the gifted word learner dogs, from that Budapest study earlier, the ones who could remember dozens of toy names. Those exceptional dogs tilted their heads 43% of the time when asked for a specific toy. Ordinary dogs in the exact same setup, hearing the exact same trained words, tilted only 2% of the time. Same words, same training, same room. The difference wasn't the sound reaching their ears, it was almost certainly something about how much processing that sound triggered on the way to being understood. So here's the honest, complete picture, built from evidence instead of guesswork. Hearing is real, and it's genuinely impressive, but the science on precision localization suggests the tilt itself isn't proven to sharpen it. Vision is a clever, plausible idea, but it comes from an unpublished survey, not a peer-reviewed study, and even that survey's own numbers don't fully support it. And meaning the brain actually working to process a word it knows has the newest, most direct, most carefully controlled evidence behind it, cross-checked against a second, completely independent brain imaging study 8 years earlier. That's not a coin flip between 3 equally good guesses. That's a case where the evidence has a clear leader with an honest asterisk about surprise and attention still attached. So, what do you actually do with this? Here's how to read your dog's head tilt for what the evidence says it most likely is, without overclaiming and without ignoring what you now know. Before you read anything into a head tilt, notice the context. Did it happen the instant you said a word your dog knows its name? Outside? Dinner? That's the pattern the strongest evidence points to. Did it happen during a sudden noise? A squeak? Something unexpected? That's more likely the surprise and attention pathway, the same one that explains the jack-in-the-box effect. Both are real. They're just not the same thing, and lumping them together is exactly the mistake most explanations make. Remember, only around 4 in 10 dogs in the 2025 study tilted at all. If yours never has, it isn't a red flag about intelligence or attention. Some dogs show engagement through stillness, through ear position, through a locked gaze instead of a tilted one. The tilt is one visible channel among several. A bonus you get to enjoy if your dog happens to use it. Not a test your dog needs to pass. Here's a fun, honest experiment you can actually run tonight, based directly on the evidence. Say a word your dog clearly knows its name, a favorite toy, walk, in a normal, warm tone. Then, a few minutes later, say a made-up word in that exact same warm tone, total nonsense, same energy, same volume. If your dog tilts more reliably for the real word than the nonsense one across a few repeats, you're watching a rough, at-home version of exactly the comparison the 2025 researchers ran in their lab. It's not a certified science experiment, but it's grounded in a real one, and it might tell you more about what your dog actually understands than you'd expect. When you're the person at the dog park who actually knows this stuff, resist the urge to turn likely related to processing meaningful words. With real uncertainty around startle and attention into science, prove dogs tilt their heads because they understand you. The honest version is more interesting anyway. It's a genuine scientific mystery that's only about 60% solved, with a brand new, very promising lead. That's a better story than false certainty, and it's the actual story. One last thing, and it matters more than anything else in this video. Everything we've covered is about a brief, responsive tilt tied to sound and speech, seconds long, resolving on its own, happening in the middle of normal interaction. That is completely different from a head tilt that doesn't go away, a constant, uncorrecting lean to one side, especially paired with stumbling, circling, unsteady eyes, or vomiting. That combination can signal an inner ear infection or a neurological issue like vestibular disease, and it needs a veterinarian, not a comment section. If your dog's head is tilted and it isn't a quick, responsive reaction to something you just said or a noise it just heard, if it's constant, that's the one head tilt that isn't cute and shouldn't wait. Here's what I keep coming back to. For over a decade, this exact gesture got explained away with a shrug and a guess 3 tidy little theories, repeated so often on the internet that nobody thought to check which one, if any, had actually been tested. It took a scientist with a fist held up to his nose in 2013 to plant a real question. It took an MRI scanner in 2016 to map where language actually lives in a dog's brain. And it took a phone camera, an AI trained to read a dog's face, and 103 ordinary family dogs filmed at home to finally catch the pattern on camera, less than a year before you watch this video. So the next time your dog's head tips sideways mid-sentence, you don't have to reach for awe as the whole explanation. You're very possibly watching a small, visible flicker of a brain doing real work sorting sound from meaning, running a word it's heard 100 times through the exact circuitry built to understand it. It's not a trick. It's not a performance for your approval. It's closer to watching someone pause, mid-conversation, to place a familiar voice. If this changed how you see that tilt, do me a favor. Next time it happens, notice exactly what you just said, and tell me in the comments. I want to know what word gets your dog's head cocking sideways. If you want more of the real science behind the things your dog does without a manual, subscribe, because that's the whole mission at petmindlabs. Taking the guesses everyone repeats, and checking them against what was actually measured. Next time, we're staying with the body, what it really means when your dog leans a paw against you. I'm glad you're here. This is petmindlabs. Stop guessing. Start seeing.